Very good. All right. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Toby Dalton. I'm the co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program here at the Carnegie Endowment. And it's great to see all of you. Great to see my friends and colleagues on the stage, and those of you also joining online. So we're gathered at a kind of interesting time for the question that is in the title of this panel, which is about nuclear latency, which is kind of a wonky term. Basically, it means if a state has the technical capability to build nuclear weapons but hasn't made the political decision to do so. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And as I was thinking about the setup for this conversation, I think it's easy to think of this as like a really wonky or maybe historical or theoretical kind of idea, but it's actually a really practical and contemporary one, and I think that's really what we're going to get into in the discussion today. So we have some things that are happening like right now that policy officials in the US government and other governments are dealing with that turn on this question of how some of our allies and partners and adversaries use this capacity, this nuclear latency, to coerce the US and others for benefits, basically. So we see in South Korea, for instance, there's a very active conversation about whether to acquire nuclear weapons or not. And some people there seem to be using the fact of that conversation in a very instrumental way to convince the US to provide South Korea more in terms of security benefits. We hear similar things out of Saudi Arabia, where there's periodic mentions by Saudi officials about the utility that nuclear weapons would provide to Saudi Arabia. And indeed, according to some reporting in the New York Times recently, apparently the Saudis want the U.S. to also give for the U.S. to give Saudi nuclear energy, but also enrichment, which would increase its latency, which in theory would increase also then its ability to coerce the U.S. So these messages that we see in these foreign capitals are effectively targeting the U.S. And are really coercive in nature to kind of compel these benefits. And so we're really fortunate to have a very timely book out. It's called Leveraging Latency, How the Weak Compel the Strong with Nuclear Technology by our friend and colleague Tristan Volpe, who has spent a lot of time looking at this phenomenon and trying to understand it better, and that's what this book is about. Like good political science, it uses historical analysis to build an analytic framework that actually has a lot of contemporary relevance. And so Tristan will talk a little bit about that framework and tee up some issues that then the group will discuss. But I'm hopeful that we'll actually spend a lot of time talking about the contemporary ways that this problem is really with us. And so we'll have Ken and Heather and Ankit to look at issues ranging from Iran to the acquisition of dual-capable conventional missile systems and arms control. And especially want to walk through and try to better understand how changes in the technology space and in the regimes that are set up to control those technologies have shaped the coercive bargaining that we're seeing, and how that might have implications for future cases, whether it's South Korea or Saudi or others. And what should we do about it? You know, what does the policy toolkit look like to deal with it? So we've got a great panel. I'll start with Tristan, who's kind of the man of the hour here with his book. He's an assistant professor in the Defense Analysis Department of the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School and also a non-resident scholar here at Carnegie. Heather Williams is director of the Project on Nuclear Issues, also better known as PONY at the CSIS, and senior fellow in the International Security Program there. Next to her is Ken Kane, who is the director of the Middle East Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Ankit Panda, who is Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program here at Carnegie. So we'll start. Tristan will spend a little bit of time laying out the analytic framework, and then we'll get into a conversation here and then with all of you. So Tristan, over to you.
Great. Toby, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out today, and for those of you that are online. It's really great to be back at Carnegie with this superb group of panelists here to discuss some implications and extensions from my book. So perhaps you'll permit me some brief prepared remarks. I just want to get the core argument on the table so that we can have a bit more of a free-flowing discussion afterwards about some of the contemporary implications, as Toby noted. Now, leveraging latency really explores how small states use nuclear technology specifically to compel concessions from much stronger states in world politics. As Toby noted, we've seen several vivid illustrations of this strategy on display in recent months. Nuclear musings from South Korea and Saudi Arabia both seem designed to some degree to try to gain bargaining leverage over Washington when it comes to various political or security issues that are being negotiated. The basic message I see from some of the kind of public rhetoric is that unless Washington yields to these demands that are on the table, the South Koreans or the Saudis might have no choice left but to reconsider their respective nuclear options. Now, this strategy is not new. As I trace out in the book, over the last 7 decades, we've seen a diverse group of states attempt to leverage the mere threat of acquiring atomic weapons to try to compel concessions from great powers who opposed proliferation, notably the United States, but also the Soviet Union during the peak of the Cold War. Now, some, such as West Germany and Japan, were key US allies who used investments in nuclear energy infrastructure to put pressure on Washington during the Cold War for stronger security commitments or military assistance. Others, more recently, such as North Korea in the 90s or the 2000s, or Iran, were adversaries of the United States who came to leverage latency, but only under considerable duress once they were basically caught in secret pursuit of some sort of nuclear weapon effort. Now, using nuclear technology in this manner as a coercive instrument adheres to a pretty sound strategic logic. Superpowers, notably the United States, face pretty strong incentives to try to keep adversaries and even some of their closest allies and friends from acquiring the bomb. Why? Well, atomic weapons are some of the great equalizers of power among nations, right? If a small state, if an ally, builds even a rudimentary nuclear force, it essentially undercuts that superpower's ability to project power, manage its nuclear operations, and shape outcomes across the globe. So proliferation becomes this key sensitive pressure point for superpowers. And smaller states can essentially prey upon this fear of future proliferation by basically carefully moving closer to the bomb, or even just threatening to do so. They can try to ratchet up pressure on Washington to comply with demands for various concessions. But to make this threat of proliferation more believable, right, more credible, leaders have to select from a tried and true menu of bargaining tactics. The most explicit that we can see on display involve mobilizing or protecting nuclear enterprises. I think most vividly you could see Iran's efforts in the past to try to ramp up production in a sort of calibrated way at hardened fuel enrichment plants, or North Korea's plutonium reprocessing campaigns back in the 1990s or early 2000s. And these steps to kind of increase latency, they really demonstrate that state's capability, but also, even more importantly, their steely resolve to move forward under potential pressure to cross that kind of nuclear threshold. Leaders can also enhance threat credibility by making moves at home within the domestic political arena. It's pretty hard and expensive to build nuclear projects, right? You can't just wave a magic wand and all of a sudden you have an advanced enrichment or a processing plant. Empowering elites, such as scientists, engineers, key political stakeholders, with resources and political autonomy, helps commit a small state to moving forward with these incredibly expensive, large nuclear projects. In addition, leaders often cultivate public support, among the general public to try to increase kind of buy-in for a nuclear program. And this can really increase some of the domestic costs associated with giving up on nuclear goals or even rolling back a nuclear program in the future. By essentially tying their hands to move forward with a nuclear project in this manner, deaf leaders can constrain themselves from backing down when they're at the bargaining table with negotiators from the United States. Yet, this unique form of coercion does not always work. As I lay out in the book, some allies and adversaries were quite successful in using their nuclear programs to essentially wrest concessions from the United States. But for many others, however, the gambit failed to yield any tangible concessions and often generated pretty costly blowback. Think of sanctions or kind of the reaction of a superpower once they're threatened with proliferation, right? So this raises a really fundamental question that the book focuses on, which is about when smaller states or when the weak are actually able to compel the strong with nuclear technology. Now, the conventional wisdom is that leveraging latency is most effective when a state is quite close to being able to build an atomic weapon. Once a country can build the bomb quickly on short notice in this manner, it seems like it should be in a very strong position to make that threat credible, to dial up pressure. Now, this idea has a pretty intuitive allure. When a small state's nuclear program is in its infancy, by contrast, right, this low level of latency might not be enough to make some of those bargaining tactics I outlined effective. Superpowers, the United States, they're likely to brush off these threats as infeasible, you're too far away, or mere cheap talk. I kind of see this with Saudis, the fact that they are perennially kind of discussing their opening bids for nuclear energy programs. So marching to the cusp of the bomb should solve this problem by making proliferation threats far more believable, far more credible, right? The nearly nuclear state is now in a prime position to ratchet up pressure and, more importantly, signal their resolve that they actually might follow through with the threat if the United States doesn't comply. But this intuitive idea is actually fundamentally flawed, and that's really what the book focuses on, because it overlooks a lot of the challenges that these states face with not only making their proliferation threats credible, but also their non-proliferation assurances ironclad, right? You not only have to kind of dial up pressure, but you also have to convince the United States that you're not going to just repeat this kind of blackmail playbook in the future. So for coercion to work, each step towards the bomb must eventually be offset with a promise, indeed an ironclad commitment of nuclear forbearance. Otherwise, there's really no reason for the United States or another target to concede, right? This is a classic insight from Thomas Schelling. Okay, so coercion seems to pull small states onto the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, they need enough nuclear latency, enough capability to underwrite proliferation threats against far more powerful players that could stop them, such as the United States. But on the other hand, they also need to commit themselves to nuclear restraint once the strong comply with their demands. And this trade-off between making threats and assurances credible only becomes sharper and sharper as states approach the nuclear threshold. They must go to greater lengths to make believable non-proliferation commitments. The nuclear program itself often needs to be frozen, demobilized, or rolled back in some concrete way. The problem is that leaders often cede control to elite stakeholders or activate public support at home to build these nuclear projects in the first place, to get them off the ground. And this ends up entrapping them in a sort of sticky course of action that's very difficult or costly to overturn, to kind of move a nuclear program back away from the threshold. However, the key take-home of the book is that there's basically a sweet spot along the latency continuum, where leaders should be in the best position to essentially make their threats and assurances believable, credible. The boundaries of the sweet spot, I find, really align with the capacity to produce the fissile material at the heart of an atomic weapon. This is enrichment reprocessing technology. Once a nuclear program enters this Goldilocks zone, it becomes harder for the United States or another great power to inhibit proliferation with unilateral tools alone. Each step forward should kind of put pressure to cut a diplomatic deal before it's too late. At the same time, this modest level of latency should put small states in a prime position to be able to make credible non-proliferation commitments. Domestic politics is far less likely at this stage to distort some of the incentives that leaders face when it comes to limiting their nuclear program. As a result, the leverage that states gain from latency kind of resembles a bell curve or an upside-down U when plotted against the capability continuum. Few bargaining advantages at low and high levels of latency, but significant benefits in that kind of middle zone. Okay, so what does this mean for how the United States should respond to countries that leverage latency in the years ahead? One take-home implication here is that Washington faces a prime opportunity to try to strengthen non-proliferation initiatives when it engages with states at very low levels of latency. Now, this is a rather obvious point that should come as no shock to anyone, but it's worth emphasizing because beyond Iran, which we'll discuss, The prime candidates for attempting to leverage latency, as we noted at the outset, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, lack industrial scale enrichment or processing capabilities, although, as we'll talk about, South Korea could quite rapidly scale up if they wanted to. Now, nuclear energy programs are much more vulnerable and open to policy change at this kind of lower level of latency. And this essentially gives US officials a stronger hand to make any sort of concessions that they provide conditional on, let's say, Saudi Arabia adhering to stricter non-proliferation obligations, or in South Korea's case, simply continuing to uphold their long-standing non-proliferation commitments, right? So to wrap up, the take-home implication from the book is that states often face a dilemma between making coercive threats and assurances credible, right? This means we should pay particular attention to how the nature of technology really shapes this trade-off beyond just the nuclear realm. I expect this tension, really to be especially severe whenever governments must make large, sticky investments in dual-use nuclear technology. That's why I'm really excited to hear Ankit's thoughts on investments in long-range missile and space launch capabilities. These seem to be prime candidates for also kind of falling into this zone of maybe being able to kind of ratchet up the threat of converting these conventional capabilities into future nuclear delivery vehicles. But at the same time, it's going to be, I think, very difficult, given the operational benefits of these capabilities, to kind of dial back a program once you've developed those systems. Finally, the ability of small states to leverage latency matters not only for the health of the global non-proliferation regime, but potentially could also impact the future of arms control among nuclear-armed nations. If more countries end up developing the capacity to field nuclear forces on short notice, hoisting up this kind of sword of Damocles might influence the incentives that the major nuclear powers, namely US, China, and Russia, face to limit or reduce their own nuclear forces in the future. All right, those are my prepared remarks. I very much look forward to the loose discussion after this. Thank you all.
Well, thanks, Tristan. I think you put a lot on the table for us to think about, and so I want to just dive right in. Ken, I want to start with you and ask you to reflect a little bit on what you read in the book about the analytic framework and how Tristan applied it to Iran. And really, what does it tell us about what we might think Iran is doing today? If you look at the news, they've increased the level of enrichment very close to the level that's required for use in nuclear weapons, the amount of material that they're keeping on hand. By Tristan's account, it seems like they're out of the sweet spot now. So what are they doing?
Okay, so first, wonderful book. Congratulations, Tristan. And thank you, Carnegie, for having us here. So with regard to Iran, I would say in different times, I would say most of the times, Iran did not pursue compellence as a strategy. And as Tristan rightly said in the book, they really hid their program, and then it was discovered. And at times, they negotiated parts of the program, but Iran, and I'm sorry for that, has been very complicated case study because what they were trying to negotiate on is what the West was trying for them to give up. So there was really no negotiation about anything because it was a zero-sum game almost. So when the negotiations failed, and I would say, I will think they actually failed in the two first case studies, both in the 2003 to 5, which is the EU+3 negotiations, as well as the swap of the fuel swap, which is 2009 and 10, I think. Those were cases where the West demanded Iran to forgo their enrichment capabilities. Iran refused because that was what they were talking about. So there was not really a compellence issue what they can negotiate when it's what is negotiated is also the objective as well as what they're supposed to compel. So I will actually claim that it failed in both cases. Where it succeeded relatively was in the JCPOA, when on one end there was a restraint on the enrichment capabilities and Iran agreed to those restraints, but I will say it's because the other option was almost collapse of the regime. So when Iran had to choose in previous cases between enrichment to no enrichment, or enrichment and sanctions, they chose enrichment, although despite of the sanctions. When it got to the point that they really needed to choose between regime, almost collapsed to the enrichment, they chose the survival of the regime. So this is sort of the historical part of where we are with Iran until now. Now I would say it's really interesting, especially when we look at it from compellence aspect, because with the enrichment increased to 83 plus 7, what the IEA found in January 2023, Iran claimed it was unintended fluctuation of their centrifuge. The IEA rejected that explanation, and anyone that knows centrifuge operation, that's really not probably how it works. But the question is why they've done it, right? And there's several explanations. The one is that they really tried to test their centrifuge capacity. They didn't think the IEA will find out, and although it did find out, Iran made those mistakes in the past, thinking the IEA will not find some of their violation, which the IEA found. They might have also wanted to test the IEA verification regime mechanism, and they found out what the IEA can and cannot find. I don't think the intention was to accumulate enrichment, and the IEA confirmed there is no accumulation, but they did break up their centrifuge and then probably put it back to where it was before, to the 60%. The problem is that it is a violation of the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement, and that's where Iran was really put on notice before the board meeting, and that's why Grossi went to Iran to negotiate some compromise. Iran agreed to some wrenching up of their verification mechanism. So this is where we are right now, where the IEA and Iran are negotiating about a stronger verification, and on the other end, also explanation how we got to the 83 plus 7%. So this is sort of the background how we got to where we are today. So the question why they want to do it and is it compellence or not? And I would say, what are the possible explanations of why they will want to do it from compellence perspective? One is to try to compel the US to negotiate back to the negotiation table. So far, it didn't succeed. They might have tried to prevent Iran being referred to the Security Council. They succeeded in that, in the sense, but it's really interesting because it's actually in the last board meeting, the Europeans wanted to actually have a resolution against Iran because of this violation, and the US actually prevented that from happening, and mainly for other reasons. The US is really their objective right now, or main interest right now, is dealing with that on the IEA level to try to get Grossi and the IEA dealing with this problem while the US is dealing with other priorities. So interestingly enough, Iran succeeded, but not, I think, from the reasons that they thought it will. And then the last aspect that they might want to have compellence is to gain leverage, so to gain more technological capabilities that when negotiation ever started, they will have something to give up. So this is another area where they might want to gain some compellence aspect of that. So I think we are much more in a compellence, sort of Iran compellence strategy today than we were in the past.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, it's your sense is that Iran is banking capability today for a future period in which negotiations might become possible again.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the logic that we have right now with regard to the JCPOA was gaining time, right? The JCPOA entire idea was to gain the 1 year roll back Iran capability to the 1 year of breakout capabilities. Because Iran developed so much and acquired so much capabilities now that also related to weaponization aspects, we actually lost this 1 year breakout capacity anymore. So even if we restore to JCPOA, if it was as it was in 2015, we don't have this 1 year breakout because of the advances that Iran did so far. So if they do need to give up on something, they might be on those range of the more almost weaponization activities. One more point that I just also want to make is that there is this misconception that you need to get to 90% to enrich to have nuclear weapons. US and others did produce nuclear weapons with much less. So we don't need to get, it's not that Iran enriched to 83, but they need to get to 7% more. 83% can be used for nuclear weapons warheads. So this is a misconception that I just want to make sure it's not repeated in other places.
Yeah, no, totally understood. I think it's worth coming back to, in a little bit later, this question of, as you said, Iran has accumulated almost too much capability. And so the restraints may no longer be as credible to the international community if Iran does agree to another.
Right, and this is actually, Tristan said very eloquently in the book, in one point your capabilities are so high and advanced that you not only it's harder for you to restrain them, it's harder for you to prove the strong power that you actually will not repeat the violation. Exactly. So it's really harder to get to a deal when you get to higher levels of latency.
Yeah, and just small point of clarification on this. It's not that bargaining is always going to fail at these high levels, right? It's just that, as you can see by tracing out the costs and the efforts that Iran had to go through to kind of negotiate the JCPOA, it's just much more, the barriers, the hurdles are much higher, right? And that means that whatever concessions you're reaping from the deal, you have to kind of weigh those benefits against all the costs and the risks that you've assumed to kind of deal with either internal domestic factions or the cost of kind of illuminating your nuclear program in a much more, with a much harsher light, or kind of rolling back those capabilities. So very well said, thank you.
Yeah. I want to switch gears slightly, and I'll turn to you and ask kind of the same question, which is to reflect a little bit on Tristan's framework, but focus more on the conventional missiles. And you've been doing a lot of work looking at the accumulation of missiles in Asia in particular. And so it's a different kind of latency. It's not fissile material latency, which is really how Tristan defined the piece of his work. So I'm curious, as Tristan set up, does it work the same way? Does it work differently? What are you seeing in terms of the effort or the potential effort from states who are accumulating these capabilities to use them also in some sort of compellant strategy?
Yeah, thanks. Let me echo, of course, congratulations to Tristan on his excellent new book. The big difference that I think is operative here is effectively the perspective of the United States towards primarily its allies pursuing these capabilities. I spend a lot of my time looking at these dynamics in the Asian region, or the Indo-Pacific, I guess we call it these days. And the fundamental thing you see from Australia to Japan to South Korea is, broadly speaking, Washington being quite encouraging of its allies acquiring these capabilities amid a deteriorating geopolitical environment. And these countries themselves see these capabilities as augmenting strategies of deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment against North Korea, China, et cetera. And Washington largely buys into that, right? We can look at the reaction from the Biden administration and the Trump administration to Australia's 2020 Defense Strategic Update, which included a big call for a surge in precision strike capability. More recently, Japan's new national defense strategy and national security strategy. And similarly with South Korea, where for a much longer period of time now, the United States have been broadly encouraging of Seoul's pursuit of delivery systems. Let me use South Korea as an illustration because it's already come up in this discussion, and it's a really interesting case because we do see, of course, an open fuel cycle, no ENR tech available, but we also see an incredibly capable strike capability at work in South Korea. South Korea is the only country, for instance, that maintains a conventional submarine-launched ballistic missile capability. I remember when they first tested that, there were a lot of questions asked about Seoul's long-term intentions. Washington and Seoul also had for several decades a bespoke bilateral arrangement called the Missile Guidelines that were first agreed in 1979, around the time that the United States actually put South Korea's Cold War era nascent nuclear weapons program into the box. And the Missile Guidelines were an effort by the United States to ensure that Seoul would not have the kind of latency that you're referring to, Toby, that Seoul, if it did decide to pursue nuclear weapons again, would not have long-range delivery systems. That concern has eroded over a number of years, particularly as the threat from North Korea has intensified. Successive administrations in Seoul, both conservative and progressive alike, actually, have made pleas to Washington, arguably with different logics, for why South Korea should have the ability to rapidly scale up its own strike capabilities. And so that fundamental difference in Washington's fundamental approach to non-proliferation as a policy end versus allied strike capability as augmenting deterrence strikes me as fundamentally important to sort of thinking about this issue of latency. Now, on January 11th this year, we of course had major headlines coming out of South Korea when President Yoon Suk-yeol became the first South Korean leader since South Korea transitioned to democracy to publicly contemplate the idea of Seoul acquiring nuclear weapons. He didn't do so in a considered way. It was part of a rambling menu of options that he presented. But it was really interesting that Yoon specifically alluded to South Korea's scientific and technical expertise in making that comment. And the implication there is not only South Korea's considerable scientific expertise in the area of nuclear technology, but also delivery systems. So I think it does help underwrite the credibility of that threat. Now, I think if we had to assess the aggregate credibility of a South Korean threat to proliferate in the short term, fissile material, I think, still is, of course, the primary constraint. But when it comes to these delivery systems, I don't think anybody would deny that if Seoul were to acquire the ability to, let's say, enrich or reprocess, produce fissile material at scale, that South Korea could very quickly become credible with regard to its strike capabilities. I think these factors are less pertinent with other cases in the region. Particularly, I'm thinking here of Japan and Australia. For instance, Australia, I think, is a particularly interesting case because amid the non-proliferation debates that have sprung up around AUKUS, for instance, it's been incredibly rare. In fact, I can't recall a single conversation on AUKUS that is focused on Australia's potential for weaponizing, longer term, pursuing nuclear weapons, specifically in the context of Canberra's pursuit of strike systems. So that strikes me as, I think, the core kind of difference here between the two cases. Washington fundamentally, I think, views this as broadly enhancing general deterrence in the region. Now, what will be interesting, particularly in Asia, I think, is whether at some point the United States will grow concerned about the escalatory potential of these allied missile capabilities. And that could actually bring us back to that could actually make the proliferation of strike capabilities somewhat more comparable with the concerns that the United States has traditionally had about allies possessing nuclear weapons. That hasn't happened quite yet, but it's possible that as these capabilities proliferate, potentially as we observe future crises either on the Korean Peninsula or in East Asia, that this could become a more pertinent part of the debate between Washington and its allies.
Yeah, that's good. I want to come back to missile issues in a little bit because I think they actually cut across all three of the slices that we're going to take in slightly different ways. Heather, I want to turn to you now and ask sort of the same question, if you could reflect a little bit on the framework that Tristan has put forward. And then you've worked a lot on both arms control and also the newest element of the international nuclear regimes, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it seems like the idea of nuclear latency is pretty complicated for both of those enterprises, but for very different reasons. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see it playing out in both areas.
Yeah, sure. I also want to just echo everyone else and congratulations, Tristan. One specific plug that I will make, though, is political science books aren't always the easiest read. I wouldn't say page turners when I think of political science books, and I just thought your book was incredibly readable and really clear and cogent. So just really congratulations on a great achievement. So to Toby, to your question, I think there's, so with regards to Tristan's framework and the book and what it means, I think what I'll kind of structure this is what it means for U.S. arms control efforts, what it means for the NPT, and then say a little bit, but not much on the TPNW. On the arms control side, I think that Tristan's book makes a really great case for how allies, potential proliferation to allies latency, how it can increase these pressures in the U.S. to pursue arms control efforts, to pursue limits, pursue reductions. One real strength of the book, I think, is its discussion about domestic issues. So I think that is a really important contribution. As I was reflecting on it and listening to the discussion, though, I thought there might actually be a little bit of a paradox here, though, which is if allies' latency increases pressure on the U.S. to pursue arms control, a lot's going to depend on why they want latency, right? Because if they're pursuing latency, potential nuclear capabilities out of concern of U.S. credibility, the U.S. pursuing arms control is going to have the opposite effect on that, right? I mean, so I think that to some extent, the devil's going to be in the details. So if it's, massive reductions that will mean a rollback of any forward deployed capabilities, that's just going to increase allies' concerns and might actually have the opposite effect. So it's really just going to depend on what are the allies' incentives for doing this, what's going on in the US domestically, so boring answer is multi-causal. But I think that that's kind of an interesting paradox, just having seen recently, we're hearing a lot about allies' concerns about US credibility, particularly with frequent changes of administration that take very different approaches to allies, say very different things. And so it's a latency issue. It might also be a hedge against future US changes. And in that sense, again, arms control might become a little bit trickier. But I think that Tristan does show, I think, the data and the history to show that there is that intersection of allies' latency and US arms control interests. On the NPT side, I think there's a vicious cycle to some extent here, which is if you have a weak NPT, then it's not going to have as much constraining power on the allies, right? And so I think there more needs to be done on how constraining is the NPT right now. But so if you have a weak NPT, doesn't have constraining power on allies, well, then how could you strengthen the NPT? It would be that the US has to start showing reduction, the P5 in general have to start showing reductions. But if you do that, then that could undermine the credibility. And so I think that we're a little bit stuck in that cycle right now. I'm pretty skeptical. I'm not skeptical. It's not the right word. I don't feel particularly confident about the NPT at the moment. I think it's in a really fragile state. Everyone says the next review cycle is the most important. This is the most important election that there will ever be. It's kind of like the NPT RevCons as well. This one really is important. It's a shorter cycle. The NPT has a lot to prove for itself to show that it is still the treaty that it once was and that it can still have that constraining power. So I think that figuring out for the US and the P3 in particular, kind of figuring out how to break that cycle is going to be really important so that the NPT does have more constraining power. And Tristan in the book touches on this. I do just think that NPT is kind of a vehicle. The impact that it has on allies, I think, is sometimes underappreciated a little bit. But I would say that I hang out in NPT crowds. On the TPNW, to be honest, I think that this is one of many missed opportunities for the TPNW. That the TPNW took such a strict approach to everything, to all things nuclear. That the US allies that rely on nuclear weapons for extended deterrence, that all the P5 really weren't involved in the negotiation. And so as a result, ending up with this very strict ban, you kind of miss these really important issues that just I just don't see them getting factored into the treaty in any way. One interesting question would be if a country maintains a latent nuclear capability but isn't TPNW member, are you in compliance? Which gets to one of the fundamental problems with the treaty is the lack of verification. With that said, I do want to give credit where it's due that the TPNW meeting of states parties established a science and tech working group. Obviously they know the verification problem. And so I would be curious to see how that working group evolves and thinks about verification. How do you define latency? For example, if Iran came along and said that they wanted to join the TPNW, right now, would TPNW states say, well, you aren't a declared nuclear weapons state, sure, come on in. That's, it's not a really good look for the TPNW, I would say. And so that's something that I actually do think that they recognize this and are going to try to work it out. But otherwise, kind of missed opportunity, as I said.
So I'm going to hopefully take questions after another round of my questions. And so for those of you both in the room and online, if you have questions that you're starting to think about, be prepared to ask those in a little bit. As I said, I wanted to come back to the issue of missiles and how they cut through all of these things. And Ken, I want to come back to you because Iran also has an increasingly robust missile and space program. It is overshadowed by what's happening with enrichment in particular, but it's there. And I'm curious if you see also Iranian investments there having a similar potential coercive or compellent logic to them, or are they being done in different ways that don't kind of have the same ratcheting potential that the enrichment program has had?
So first, we need to distinguish, I think, between the arsenal that Iran has between the short-range rockets / the long-range missiles. So, and because they're used for different purposes. So for the short-range and rockets, those are being used already mostly, I would say, 3 functions. One is attacking or threat to attack. So that's when we saw it, for example, when Iran practically attacked the oil, Aramco's facility in Iraq, or when in Saudi Arabia, or when Iran attacked U.S. bases in Iraq. So this is when they're using it for or punishment. That was a retaliation for the killing of so many, or to try to inflict enough damage to prevent in other areas. Mainly that was a Yemen issue. So we see already Iran using their short range also for deterrence. So for example, the capabilities that they have, the fact that they are sitting in Syria, just north of Israel, that's a way to deter Israel from attacking Iran directly in Iran. And the third one is really projection of power. So this is where we see Iran really helping proxies in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria. So we see areas where they're using it conventionally already. So I don't think it's ratcheting up, ratcheting down as much as like they already laid out what is the lay of the land of what they will do and what they will not do. With regard to the ballistic missiles capabilities, this is obviously more have both conventional as well as nuclear missions, or can have. And that's where Iran, that's where also we see the EU starting to be concerned, and that's why we have, for example, the UN Security Resolution 2231 that added missile dimension to the JCPOA because they are related to each other and because there is a mission to the missiles that can be nuclear related. So where we see really Iran has been using that is in two ways. One is related to tests, so showing capabilities and showing how far they can reach geographically, as well as really, really proving that they master some knowledge capacity. So for example, or trying to mention, so one is re-entry vehicles as well as guidance systems. So those are aspects that we know that Iran is working on. Some of that they master, some aspect they have not. And that's where we see that the ability to really wrench up if they want or not. Yeah. And the interesting part is sort of the self-imposed 2,000 kilometers, which was the idea was to tell the Europeans, we self-impose ourselves. But we know that this is really where Iran at the same time improved their payload as well as their accuracy. So those are things that you can actually play with these three aspects, is the range as well as payload as well as, and that's where Iran is playing that game, which is, I don't necessarily think it's a compellence because Iran is not willing to negotiate any aspects of that. And the self-imposed sort of, maybe the self-imposed part was to prevent some European sanctions. Or Europe to support the U.S. in some sanctions, but it's mainly deterrence.
Yeah. Ankit, I want to come to you next, and then Tristan, I'm going to come back to you with the idea of what this kind of does to your theoretical framework. So one of the questions that Tristan kind of toyed with a little bit in the book, Ankit, is how allies' missile programs also create some potential capability to exit the alliance, and that's kind of part of the coercive, the compellent threat. I'm curious how you see that playing out in the U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, and whether you see thinking about exit as part of what's happening in the missile space, or is it more about, to borrow a phrase, kind of how to better integrate deterrence among allies in ways that increases the potential value of conventional deterrence?
I think it's frankly both, and I think that's where the stickiness of this for the allies comes from in many ways. I mean, again, I should say that no two allies in the region are exactly the same, but certainly I think, as Heather and others have alluded to, there is a general sense among allies that the United States is no longer perceived as politically reliable as it's traditionally been. And that is the fundamental building block of any alliance. It is that political solidarity, that idea that shared interests between allies will persist over long periods of time. And because that faith has now been shaken, even if Australia, Japan, South Korea, well, South Korea I think is a different case in this context, but Australia and Japan at least, even though you would never hear Tokyo or Canberra publicly, I think in the current context, allude to their autonomous strike capabilities as underwriting a capability to exit the alliance. Longer term, I think these countries do have to take into account a world where the role that the United States fundamentally plays in the Indo-Pacific looks very different than it does right now under the Biden administration. Obviously, I think there is bipartisan consensus in Washington that the United States cares about deterring and competing with China longer term. So some of these allies also, I think, are reassessing the extent to which the experience under, let's say, the Trump administration is generalizable over the long term. But I think that is certainly part of why we're seeing this sudden rush by these allies to acquire capabilities. I think it's both. We've seen sort of two parallel trends, which is the objective deterioration of the threat environment for these countries in Asia alongside concerns about the United States. And I think that has led to these incredibly costly, politically costly, fiscally costly investments in strike systems. Now, South Korea, of course, I think is a little bit of a different case because those of us who passed through Seoul in the last several months have often heard, comments on extended deterrence from South Koreans being accompanied by the suffix "for now." That for now, South Korea is reliant on the United States and sees this as useful. But the implicit unsaid supplementary comment to that is, but over the long term, if things do come to, where South Korea might need to make tough decisions for itself, Seoul would have a capability to underwrite its exit from the alliance, partly through the capabilities that it is now developing primarily for conventional deterrence. That said, I think Tristan put it well earlier that you can't just wave a wand and have an ENR capability show up overnight to then weaponize that and build a nuclear weapons program. So the credibility of those threats, if they are indeed threats, I think is fairly limited in the current context. But I think that's certainly going to be I think it's a concern that I have longer term, that these allied capabilities are going to provide intra-alliance bargaining leverage and potentially underwrite threats for these countries to leave the alliance. If we go back to a place where the United States, let's say, is taking an extortionate approach to host nation burden sharing, talks with our allies, these are the kinds of capabilities that I think will allow allies to basically bargain hard with the United States. And that could actually be healthy for intra-alliance bargaining dynamics as well. But certainly, I think in the worst case scenario, that does, I think, underwrite that threat to potentially leave the alliance if necessary.
Yeah. So Tristan, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of come in here and reflect on what you've heard. But I also wanted to sort of tee up an issue, which is, one of the questions about this, the sweet spot dilemma is the restraint part. And we had the missile guidelines as one element of restraint on South Korea, but we haven't really developed that part of the toolkit nearly as much. I mean, we've got supply regimes basically, but the idea of how you would verify other kinds of restraints is a little bit different. I'm curious how you would think about that also from a policy standpoint.
Sure. Yeah, let me pick up where Anke left off, and then I'll talk about a point that Heather raised about the TPNW, and finally conclude with this key point about deterrence. Right. Okay, so I think Ankit's exactly right. I think many allies and partners today face greater incentives to hedge their nuclear bets. Right? It's not only the rise of revanchist adversaries that they face that we also are concerned about, Russia, China. It's also concerns about anti-alliance strains within U.S. domestic politics, the reliability of Washington as a partner going forward. Right? If one of the key kind of secondary benefits of opening the nuclear umbrella, putting allies under it, is to kind of keep them from wanting their own independent nuclear forces, any concerns about holes opening in that umbrella, of course, are going to drive them to maybe not go for the bomb tomorrow, but certainly kind of invest in latency, whether it's nuclear capabilities or missile. And I wanted to double tap a point that Anke made earlier, which is that you have to oppose proliferation for this strategy that I lay out to work, right? As he noted, one of the key logics of an alliance is that you want your allies to be strong, right? You want strong allies so you can kind of combine military capabilities against a mutual adversary. And in this instance, he's exactly right. Kind of, we encourage our allies to spend more on their conventional military capabilities. There's a huge debate about free riding, for example, right? So it's a little difficult to see how countries, if we're encouraging them to invest in conventional precision strike, how they could turn around and try to leverage the threat of converting that into a delivery system. I'm sure there's that lingering fear, but I think it's a little bit harder to leverage in the same way that countries are able to use that very acute concern about acquiring the bomb. And one historical point I want to make on this is that the United States did not always oppose ally proliferation. As I detail in the book, this draws on a lot of scholarship from other political scientists and historians. Back in the Eisenhower administration, the president kind of essentially saw ally proliferation as potentially a useful tool to use against the Soviets. In particular, the Soviets, Moscow, they were scared to death about West Germany acquiring nuclear weapons. And he's very explicit in the declassified archival record that he thought he could essentially kind of, by keeping West Germany's kind of emerging civil nuclear program rather unconstrained, that this might put a lot of pressure on the Soviets to come to the bargaining table over key issues that were at the heart of the Cold War at the time. This, of course, changed when Kennedy came in office. Well, why? Again, it was the escalatory potential of ending up in a nuclear war with the Soviets. And in particular, it was the notion that the US needed to have really fine-grained command and control over its nuclear forces. Having smaller nuclear states, such as the West Germans, with a rudimentary nuclear force, they might face incentives early in a crisis to use those weapons early. And that would basically screw up the ability of the United States to kind of wage limited nuclear war in Western Europe. So from Kennedy on, the United States, Washington has faced very strong incentives to keep even its closest friends from getting the bomb, right? So that's exactly why, when we see countries hedging their nuclear bets, Washington takes notice and tries to kind of say, all right, we see that you're hedging. What can we do to allay your fears? And countries can take advantage of that. But if we don't oppose proliferation, there's no strategy to be had. If you don't fear a country acquiring a nuclear weapon, there's really no leverage to be gained there.
Just to note that there are a few people who seem to want to play that strategy card today to enable South Korea to have nuclear weapons to do something vis-a-vis China, right? Without really having addressed all of the consequences that might come from abetting such an approach.
Indeed.
I'll just leave that there.
Just leave that on the table. Heather, I really appreciate kind of your insights coming from the NPT RevCon and the TPNW world. I think one aspect that is not covered in the book is kind of the ability of states to use these investments for deterrence purposes, right? Here I want to call out the work of kind of Matthew Furman. He's doing some excellent scholarship. Hopefully he'll have a book kind of on the other side of coercion coming out within the next few years that looks at how countries kind of leverage this not to coerce or compel concessions, but essentially how could you, if you have a very advanced nuclear program, I'm thinking of like Japan's advanced reprocessing program, can you use that to deter aggression in the same way? Might you be able to get the same sort of deterrent benefits that nuclear-armed states are able to reap without all the costs associated with having to have an operational nuclear force, right? So Matt's work, I think, is going to be very foundational in this aspect, but it kind of raises a question for a world without nuclear weapons. If you're in a global zero environment, nobody has nuclear weapons, you're essentially in a world in which, unless you eliminate nuclear technology altogether, or even if you did eliminate all operational nuclear capabilities, there's still that knowledge, right? You're basically in a world where you have to think about what are the effects of latency, right? Is that a more stable world? Is that a world where the incentives to go to war are lower or higher, right? The threat of breakout is much more of a big deal in a world without nuclear weapons, right? So I think kind of really unpacking the logic of weaponless deterrence or virtual arsenals, I think is kind of foundational component of the TPNW that I don't see explored sufficiently.
If I can just really quickly respond, I think that this is a really important point because it also raises a signaling question, right? So the TPNW bans possession and threat of use. If you have a latent capability and you aren't threatening to do anything, you could hypothetically be in compliance.
Absolutely.
And so at what point in latency can it still act as a deterrent even if you don't talk about it? And as you say, there's the knowledge base as well. And so you have to, there's a lot of issues there about breakout times and like access to material. But I think that raises a really interesting question, like what actually constitutes a threat of use? Is it just possession? Is it full developed and deployed possession? And so I think you're hitting on something really important there.
I can't help myself here. I just have to, just with this, I think this is just a fascinating line of thought here, and it just takes me back to kind of the late 80s, early 90s period in South Asia, where we had recessed deterrence, screwdrivers turned away from the bomb. But I think you really, in the early 90s crisis in Kashmir, the late 80s crises between India and Pakistan, you did observe arguably the effects of nuclear deterrence at play, even with both countries having recessed undemonstrated capabilities. And of course, with Pakistan, you had the powerful catalytic effects on the United States being drawn into sort of intervening. And I think those examples are worth keeping in mind in sort of thinking through some of these scenarios. And that catalytic effect, I think, is also quite important in these discussions about coercion, because that catalytic intent with latency, I think, can operate very similarly.
So I think that's actually it's a perfect segue into my final point here, which gets back to Iran's investments, right? Is Iran really engaging in a compelling strategy, or is this more about bolstering some sort of deterrent capability, right? So I think, as you noted, the investments in advanced kind of physical material production, investments in missiles, which also have a day-to-day operational kind of military utility, and also I really like this point about demonstrating their capability, demonstrating their knowledge base, right? I think this very much kind of bolsters potentially kind of a virtual arsenal deterrent posture for Iran, especially as they've gotten to this ultra high level of latency with their latest enrichment campaign. And again, I'm really looking forward to seeing kind of Matt's work really unpack this in systematic detail. We've seen some really key contributions to this logic of kind of virtual deterrence, starting with kind of Kenneth Waltz and others in the 90s. George Perkovich wrote kind of a classic article about how this might play out in South Asia back a number of decades ago. And so I'm very keen, though, to understand whether the threat assurance dilemma that I identify in the book applies to deterrence, right? Because it's a different posture, right? The reason it's so severe for compellence is because you have to actively stoke that fear of proliferation by like dialing up a capability, mobilizing a plan, or at least making some sort of like threat, right? But with deterrence, you may not need to do that. You could just deploy the capability, and it's kind of built into that posture that, hey, you're deterring some sort of set of aggression. And so it might be easier to satisfy the assurance side. Thomas Schelling reminds us that deterrence, much of the focus of kind of let's say, superpower deterrent posture in the Cold War was precisely about making threats credible. And we just assumed the assurance side was kind of would be naturally built into it. So I do wonder if that applies to kind of weaponless or kind of latent nuclear deterrence. But I could also see situations in which potential aggressors, let's say, Israel or the United States, might look at what maybe Iran sees as a passive deterrent posture, and they see this as, well, they don't take that kind of indication at all. They see this as an inexorable march towards the bomb. And in that case, that is very much not deterring aggression. That's inviting a preventive military attack, right? So how one actually goes about solving the assurance side of the coin should be easier for deterrence, but I do think it's very important to making it effective.
And I think the important point, and this is something that, again, the TPNW does not solve, but actually blur the lines of when latency is so high that is actually already gain all the benefits or ripe all the benefits of a nuclear weapon states. And I think actually in the case of Iran, we got to that point already that it doesn't really matter. I'm not speaking about the non-proliferation regime aspects of it. This is a different aspect. But from deterrence or compellence aspects of that, they already ripe all the benefits or the fruits of being almost a nuclear weapon state without crossing or paying the price of being a nuclear weapon state. So I think we have really a political science question here. In some cases, you don't need to be a nuclear weapon state to gain all the benefits. You're enough to be what you call ultra latency, to gain those benefits. And this is a huge problem, will be a huge problem for the TPNW, and it will be a huge problem to the non-proliferation regime.
So any of you aspiring political scientists observing this, you'll hopefully take away from this that it's good to sit here and not just in the ivory tower and think great thoughts, but think practical things too. I'm happy to open it up and take any questions if any of you have questions in the room. There is one that came in online. Can you speak about South Korea's desire to get nuclear weapons? How serious are these conversations? How does the Biden administration feel about it?
I would cede to folks that spend a lot of time in Seoul.
So it sounds like you should answer that one, too.
I'm just asking the questions here. I don't.
Well, I mean, I can take a stab at it. I think the first thing to say is there are several strains of thinking about why South Korea should build the bomb, from security-aligned logics, sovereignty logics, plucking South Korea away from the United States, ontological arguments about the role that South Korea plays in international politics more broadly, that a country of South Korea's status should have the bomb. All of these theories, I don't think, have necessarily wrangled with some of the costs associated with proliferation, the practicalities of proliferation, what it means to operationalize a nuclear force, what stable deterrence with North Korea would look like if both sides of the Korean Peninsula were nuclearized, the implications for arms control, whether a nuclear-armed South Korea could coexist in an alliance with the United States. Many of these questions are insufficiently, I think, considered as part of these debates. The other part of, I think, what's interesting with South Korea that I wanted to actually say earlier is for a country that has expended, I think, tremendous amounts of treasure in building what I think is one of the world's most ambitious conventional deterrence strategies. Much of this public contemplation of the necessity of nuclear weapons and the salience of nuclear deterrence in particular can actually be interpreted as undermining the value of that very conventional deterrent that South Korea has built, right? Because especially when you have the president and potentially other senior officials or people close to the government making arguments that either the United States needs to deploy nuclear weapons on the peninsula or that Seoul needs an independent deterrent. If you're sitting in Pyongyang, I mean, one of the interpretations of that signal is that South Korea doesn't necessarily believe in its own conventional deterrent and having an ability to keep North Korea from doing all the undesirable things that it might do. The last thing I'll say on the debates in South Korea is that I do think that they are here to stay for a variety of reasons, right? I think unreliability, U.S. unreliability is one part of that. But certainly, I think North Korea's pursuit of tactical nuclear weapons has removed any and all doubt that South Korean targets would be held at risk with North Korean nuclear weapons. And that's fundamentally an unsettling, I think, development for the South Korean public, for South Korean strategic elites, and that is driving this debate. I think I'm not a fatalist about South Korean proliferation at all. I think the alliance has been through previous rough patches, and this is, I think, a moment where the Biden administration is going to probably offer Seoul some new types of mechanisms that might help allay some of these concerns. That said, I guess that does create the risk that hard bargaining from Seoul, potentially alluding to South Korea's latency, will be interpreted as having worked effectively. And so potentially that might create a moral hazard problem where South Korea and potentially other allies will have reasons to bargain with the United States through this logic.
Tristan, I was wondering if you were to start to write a new South Korea case today to go in the book, how would it start?
I actually had a South Korea case that focused on their first attempt to leverage latency, which was at a stage in which they had basically nothing, no technology whatsoever, and they tried to backstop or underwrite the threat by essentially spinning up a weaponization program. We know this from the declassified record, right? And that attempt completely failed, and if anything, it probably ended up setting the stage for them to, as Ankit aptly put it, be boxed in, in terms of having restrictions around enrichment or processing technology, which they were trying to acquire at the time. So I cut that case just because just didn't fit in. I wanted to keep this short. But yeah, I think today, kind of looking at that variation over time, right? Looking at kind of their initial attempts to try to leverage latency, I think it really raises some interesting questions about, okay, if they attempted this in the 70s, it failed. They weren't able to go down the physical material production route, although they were able to invest in knowledge and developing kind of lab-scale experimental facilities, often with collaboration with the United States. And in particular, the U.S. supplying nuclear energy technology to South Korea, I think, has had a really moderating effect on being able to put in place certain obligations and restrictions that are incredibly powerful, that hold up to this day, that they often want rolled back and were hesitant to do so. But that also drove them to invest, as Ankit said, in one of the most kind of advanced conventional counterforce capabilities that we've seen in the world today. And so I'd be very curious to kind of try to really tease out how exactly that unique combination of being technically at a low level of latency in terms of my metrics around enrichment or processing, but having a very advanced missile capability, to what degree do those kind of capability or technologies kind of intersect to put real pressure on the United States. Because I think, as we just talked about, it's like the logic isn't really there for pure missile capability, but the United States certainly has taken a lot of their demands quite seriously. So I think that's the basic bones of how I'd kind of want to unpack it today. I will say that whenever I see concerns coming out of especially allies and partners, and here I'm kind of I'm giving a side eye to the Saudis about kind of reconsidering nuclear options or threatening proliferation overtly, as MBS did a few years ago. I always see this as less of a moment to freak out and more of a moment to say this could be an opportunity, right? Because maybe this is just them trying to kind of gain some leverage over something. And in that case, I say let's embrace the moral hazard, because honestly, the cost of what we can provide is probably going to be much less than the cost of having to deal with a nuclear armed partner or adversary, especially the Saudis in the Middle East. So I do highlight the moral hazard in the book as something very real. But again, if a country is making a threat at a very low level of latency, and here the Saudis are definitely in that camp, they don't have anything really, then it's like, okay, what do you want? How can we cut a deal? That's in your interest, and that's in our interest, right? So
it's more complicated. Let me sort of welcome to the Middle East kind of a thing. So right, it's like it's never a two-player chess game, right? It's a multiplayer chess game. So when you ask what the Saudis want, so there are two kinds of components that they have been running, I would say, and some people blur the lines between them. One is related to Iran, right? It's like we want Iran being constrained on the regional level, on the nuclear level a little bit, and if not, we will match their capabilities. And when they asked them what they want, the answer was very simple. We want security assurances. Unclear if it was conventional or nuclear, and the US said no. So then they ratcheted up. Now, is it easy or not for the US to give security assurances? I would not say it's as easy as, it's very complicated. Now, we might be able to give them many things, but it needs to be really thought through. And what is the implication of proliferation if we do, or non-proliferation if we don't? The other part is with their nuclear energy program. And this is a different kinds of a game that they have been playing with compellence, is what they're saying to the US, we want you to allow us to enrich, but not as regard to Iran, but if you don't, we will go to other suppliers, right? So it's a different kinds of components games that they are playing in order to be able to enrich Iran, or to have the US not constrain their capabilities. But what they're asking in return is so high, and when we speak about sort of what I really ask is to be treated almost by Congress as a NATO-like ally, as well as to get Congress to approve weapons delivery that were suspended after Khashoggi murder. So they negotiate with the administration on something that Congress can give them or not. And this is really almost misreading US politics, because the administration cannot promise anything, and Congress, the way that they act with Saudi Arabia, is not going to happen anytime soon. So I agree, it's really important to engage Saudi Arabia. I wish the US would have done much more than what they're doing, because this is the time to do it. But it is very complicated to deliver what they want.
Yeah, and they've really been trying to leverage the outside option of going to other suppliers for nuclear energy to try to gain leverage over the United States in terms of what sort of nuclear cooperation agreement, what are the terms of that 123, as we call it? Is it one in which we have a UAE or Taiwan style kind of agreement in which you have to forswear enrichment or processing? I think that's very unlikely. But there's other sorts of non-proliferation obligations that can be built into 123s. For example, just having mere veto power over the ability to enrich or process US-supplied fuel that comes from US-supplied nuclear technology that I think could be pretty powerful in the Saudi case. But as we've seen recently, they're not even willing to broach that. They want us to, allegedly give them enrichment technology. So that's quite a bold move as an opening kind of demand. So we'll see how that plays out for them.
So I see a couple questions. We'll take, we'll do a round of questions. So let's take several in one go. So Mike is coming to you, and we'll...
Hello? Okay. So for countries like...
Please say who you are.
What's that?
Please say who you are.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Tammy Palacios. I actually don't usually work on nuclear, but this was particularly interesting for me. I'm at New Lines across the street. I usually work on counterterrorism. So for countries like Ethiopia that don't usually headline non-proliferation or nuclear conversations, right, that are exploring recently, right, potential nuclear-related deals with Russia, is TPNW, right, because they haven't signed or ratified. Is that the answer, or is there another route that would be more successful in preventing that relationship from strengthening?
Heather?
Oh, I thought we were going to do a round.
So,
do you want me to answer it now?
No, we're going to do it.
Okay.
I'm signing that one to you. Yes, please go ahead.
Great.
Hi, I'm Adele. I'm a junior fellow here at Carnegie in the American Statecraft program. Thank you all for such a great conversation. It's really interesting. I'm curious from any of you if you think that latency can only be leveraged against great powers, or if small powers ever leverage latency against other small powers, and if so, how does the U.S. know the difference if they're the intended target of that leverage, and if they're not, then are we just giving concessions when we're not actually the strategic goal of that latency?
Yeah, very good question. Right, next.
Hi, thank you. I'm Beatrix. I'm a research assistant here at Carnegie, also in the American Statecraft program. My question is, some analysts have said that Iran may never build a nuclear weapon because it's in its best interest to remain like on the edge of nuclear latency, to use it as a bargaining chip. So my question is, what do you think about this? And also, how can you tell whether a state actually wants to build a nuclear weapon or just wants to reach latency?
Good question.
Hi, thanks for such an interesting discussion. My name is Kylie Jones. I'm the junior fellow in the nuclear policy program here. My question is about the distinction between allied proliferation and adversary proliferation. Has the U.S. historically responded in the same way? And I think if you could give your own prescriptions, I guess, should it respond to allied proliferation and adversary proliferation in the same way? I think adversary proliferation obviously has direct consequences for the risk of military conflict, even if inadvertent. But I think allied proliferation has really significant consequences for the concept of deterrence as a whole. If deterrence was functioning as it should, would U.S. allies still want to proliferate? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that.
Great. So it's kind of like one for each of you. So perfect. Heather, why don't you start?
So just make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So the concern is the Ethiopia-Russia relationship on nuclear energy, and can the TPNW inhibit that relationship from moving forward? Absolutely not. That is the short answer. But there's a couple. I think there's a simple explanation that I think more interesting. One simple explanation: the TPNW just doesn't touch nuclear energy, very intentionally for a variety of reasons. But the more interesting angle, I actually think, is something that happened at the TPNW meeting of states parties, their first meeting of states parties, which was in June of last year. Now, this is a treaty that takes an extreme view to the dangers associated with nuclear weapons, with nuclear deterrence, nuclear risks, nuclear rhetoric. You can see where I'm going here, right? So we were 4 months into the Ukraine war after numerous statements by Vladimir Putin, rising nuclear risks, more than we've seen in quite a long time. You would think that this treaty would take a really strong position on a bad actor raising nuclear risks and really making escalatory behavior. The TPNW did not do that. Their outcome document of the MSP does not mention what Russia's really been up to. Not to mention, bombing of nuclear power plants, but yeah. The reason for that, as I understand, I was not there, but from having talked to people who were there and having gone through the readouts, the reason that they could not get consensus on calling out Russian behavior was because of a large number of smaller states in the global south that are relying on Russia for nuclear energy. And they didn't want to be seen as calling them out, because that might undermine these economic deals. So to some extent, the TPNW is almost having this this alternative effect of what they actually want if Russia doesn't get called out and kind of just gets away with what they're doing. So for me, this is a real problem with the TPNW, because if you understanding the quite genuine interest behind the treaty. You know, the people who put this together really mean what they say. They really do care about nuclear use and nuclear risk, and I commend them for that. But if you can't call out what has been happening for the past nearly 18 months now, I just think it undermines a lot of the objectives of the treaty. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer. I don't have a positive answer. So, but yeah.
I have a slightly optimistic take, which is that I think everything Heather said about TPNW is spot on. But I do think that Russia's use of nuclear energy exports, and here I'm talking about specifically, I'm not talking about sensitive nuclear technology like enrichment or process. I'm talking about providing nuclear power plants to countries that, you know, want a stable source of electricity production, right? Here, this is really part of a much broader strategy of a competition for influence with nuclear exports that goes back to Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program in the early Cold War, when the Soviets and the Americans were going around with what at the time you could think of was like the artificial intelligence or the 5G technology of its era. It's like, we got this amazing new civil nuclear technology. It's like, you know, we're gonna have this great kind of self-sustaining fuel cycle. Everyone gets a nuclear power plant. And I think what we've seen happen over time is that for geopolitical reasons, which we'll put to the side, but also specifically for domestic political reasons, the fact that in democracies, it's very hard to sustain nuclear energy industries relative to autocracies like Russia's kind of Putin is able to really marshal resources around state-owned enterprises like the Russian nuclear industry and aggressively kind of deploy them in a way to say, hey, we want to gain influence, we want a beachhead in a specific country of interest. Let's put together a very alluring package that's maybe completely financed or has specific kind of clauses to make it easy for the recipient country to build out their nuclear energy program. I think the big positive note I'll kind of conclude on here is that the incentives and opportunities for the United States to supplant Russia as the dominant supplier of civil nuclear energy programs, which it has become over the last 2 decades, have really changed over the last few years, both for geopolitical reasons, the incentives for Washington to compete with Moscow and especially Beijing for influence, but also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? Russia has demonstrated that it's not a responsible stakeholder. It's willing to attack civil nuclear power plants in Ukraine, brutally occupy them. It's willing to weaponize its supply of a variety of energy sources to countries on short notice. And so we've seen a lot of countries kind of reconsider whether they want to rely on Russia for nuclear fuel, for future nuclear power plants. And I will say that starting with the Trump administration, and it's now been turbocharged by the Biden administration, there's been a real effort to try to seize on this opportunity to really be aggressive about supplying countries that want to build out or move away from Russia with civil nuclear technology. So hopefully that could address the Ethiopian case.
Chen, do you want to take the Iran question?
Sure. So I'm in the camp that actually think that Iran will not become declare a nuclear weapon state either by testing or deploying nuclear weapons. And I think here, and this is actually an article that I'm writing right now, is the question is really if Iran to possess nuclear weapons, what they will achieve, for what objectives, right? And there are two, usually you have nuclear weapons for two aspects. One is security, and then the question which kind of security. It can be compellence, it can be deterrence, and the other one is prestige. I don't think Iran does. Iran is not India or Pakistan. They don't want to be recognized as a nuclear weapon state per se. That's not the objective. It can be a benefit, but not the objective. So if it is for security, which kind of security, right? And it's mainly deterrence. They want to prevent them to being attacked, and they want to be able to prevent practically to move away any potential attack from the territory away from them. So, and here what I will claim is actually Iran, by having ultra latency, actually gaining and managed to benefit from the deterrence that they would have already if they would have become nuclear weapon states. So they don't really need to cross that threshold to gain the deterrence. They're already deterring. So I will claim that Iran does not need to do it. There are some people that claim, oh, but if Israel or if they will feel that Israel or the U.S. are going to attack, they might do it. I agree with Tristan that it's actually preparation for either a test that will be demonstration to try to prevent actually might create a situation where you attract attack. So I don't think that is attractive. But when do we see Iran saying we will withdraw from the NPT or JCPOA? It's in one case only so far. It is if they will snap back, sanctions will be imposed on them. Interestingly enough, most of the saying about if they will be attacked by either US, Israel, their reply is that what we will do in retaliation is attack the Gulf states. So they really take the Gulf states as hostage in that in this threats of back and forth. They do not say we will withdraw from the NPT or JCPOA. So this is based just on statements, but I think there are important distinctions between when they say they will withdraw and when they don't.
Good. Ankit, why don't I turn to you to take the question about how we treat allies versus adversaries, and then Tristan, I'll let you take the small state compellent.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I think maybe this is a theme in a lot of what I've had to say today. It's that the U.S. is constantly balancing its non-proliferation interests against other geostrategic interests. And I think allied proliferation is back in a big way, right? These conversations we've been having about South Korea, Saudi Arabia, which isn't a capital A treaty ally, but an important partner, I think emphasizes that. Look, the toolkit for the United States with allies during the Cold War and adversaries alike was coercion. But the coercive tools that are brought to bear and the credibility of those tools, I think, varies between allies and adversaries. For instance, it's much more credible to back up a coercive threat against an adversary with the threat of military force versus against an ally where you potentially have troops deployed. So you're fundamentally relying on a different set of toolkit tools there. But the fact of the matter remains is that with many cases of allied proliferation, not all cases, but many cases, the United States has had to weigh some regional interests versus its non-proliferation interests, right? This idea that we're contending with again today, as Toby alluded to, there are some folks in Washington who think it would be helpful for the United States to encourage South Korea to go down the path of pursuing an independent nuclear deterrent for various ends. The United States, I think, has been inconsistent with the rank ordering of nonproliferation in how it approaches various allies over time. And I think as this problem of allied proliferation comes back in a big way in the 21st century, and this is where I get to, I guess, my prescription, I think the US needs to rediscover some of those reasons we've traditionally supported nonproliferation, right? Escalation potential is one of those reasons. In fact, one of the things I didn't get around to in my remarks was on the remarkable difference we see between how the U.S. has viewed the idea of providing Ukraine with long-range strike capabilities, acknowledging the escalatory potential in a time of war when I think many of these concerns are front and center for policy planners and decision makers, versus the kind of open-ended encouragement of allied pursuit of long-range strike capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, even when certain countries are openly contemplating the idea of striking command and control assets in other countries that might have something to do with nuclear operations. So my hope is that this is something that we will relearn. We've done this before. We might not have the institutional memory to really give us that muscle memory that'll be useful to bring this back. But my prescription certainly is that allied proliferation is not something the United States should open-endedly encourage.
Tristan, question on small state compellents.
Yeah, there's a few excellent questions there. Why focus only on larger, the most powerful states? Does this happen among smaller states? And then also, how does one know that they're the intended target, right? So I think starting with the kind of smaller state question, it's absolutely true that non-great powers, non-superpowers have engaged in this form of coercion against each other. Here, we heard about India, Pakistan. They very much were kind of investing in various physical material production capabilities and delivery systems. There was a period of kind of, weaponless kind of deployment for a long period of time as well. Argentina, Brazil, that's a nice little dyad in which they're kind of investing in sensitive nuclear technology. But the reason why I kind of move that aside is that for great powers, they are really the prime. They're really one of the best targets, and this might be kind of counterintuitive, right? But it's because they're so much more powerful than kind of smaller non-nuclear weapon states that they stand to lose the most, right? If you're two regional adversaries or rivals, Iran, Saudi Arabia, your conventional capabilities might be somewhat matched, just roughly. And so the threat of your kind of rival acquiring nuclear weapons is going to be a big deal, but it's it's not going to fundamentally equalize that strong versus weak relationship the same way that a much smaller adversary or ally, I'm thinking like, let's say, North Korea, which has no real ability to stand up to kind of, let's say, a sustained conventional military operation from the United States, fundamentally changes the calculus of that much stronger state to be able to deploy its conventional military force, right? So it really makes, I wanted to focus on great powers because they have such strong incentives to inhibit the spread of nuclear weapons for this reason. And again, that kind of creates this moral hazard. Like, they're essentially creating the market for other states to come and trade away their nuclear aspirations, because they're like, this could really fundamentally damage our position, our ability to reap all the benefits from being a superpower, right? If all of a sudden we have to confront all these states that have equalized up to us at a strategic level, that's not a great world for a superpower to be in. And then the question about how do you know you're in the intended target? I lay out some metrics in the book to kind of really scope down this form of coercion. There has to be demands made, and they have to be linked in some way to a proliferation threat. Now, that proliferation threat, if you're an adversary, might be very explicit, right? North Korea, for example, is like, I think I started with that case back when I was working on this as a PhD, because it was just so blatant. It was so explicit what they were saying about, hey, we're gonna start up this, we're gonna start moving fuel out of a cooling pond, and we're gonna start reprocessing it, and then, unless you do X, Y, and Z. It was very, very explicit. But the benefit of having a really rich, declassified archival record of negotiations with allies in the Cold War is that we can see what went on behind closed doors. And often the threats that allies made to US officials here in Washington or on trips abroad or through other channels were much more implicit and much more subtle. But you could definitely see the logic play out, where leaders from West Germany or Japan would say, well, we're thinking of reconsidering this pledge that we made a while ago to not build nuclear weapons, or maybe we will hold out on joining the NPT at the time, right? Those are very clear indicators that you're in a bargaining situation relative to maybe just going for the bomb. But again, if the US thinks it's pure bargaining, they're not going to give as much. So that's why this kind of tension emerges, because that ally has to walk this fine line between convincing the US that they might actually do it. They might cash in their hedge, right, their insurance policy, and exit the alliance, while at the same time saying, but actually, we won't if you give us what we want, right? So it should be no mystery whether the target is actually being targeted. The real question is, will the concessions that the Washington or in the Cold War Moscow would put on the table, are those actually going to manage proliferation?
I think that's a great place to wrap things up for the day. Thanks to all of you for a really rich discussion. I think a lot of the themes that we covered today, this isn't the end of those themes. We're going to see a lot of this kind of discussion coming out, whether it's more headlines in the New York Times about allies demanding certain things or what. I think this has given us a good way of thinking about interpreting those kind of articles in the future. Tristan, congratulations again on a great book, and thanks again to all of you for a really productive discussion.
Thank you all. Excellent comments, everyone. Really appreciated that. It's a great discussion.